Thank you so much for joining us today after a while. I'm very, very excited to be here, in the space after a while. I'm also particularly excited to be introducing Chulu, who is going to be co-facilitating the session with me today. Chulu is our education coordinator at the African Climate Alliance. Chulu, would you like to say hello?
Thank you so much, Michelle. Hello, everyone. As Michelle has said, my name is Chulu, and you probably will be seeing me a lot more, and I hope to be seeing everyone that's here a lot more in our upcoming workshops and our dialogues. Yeah, I'm really excited for this, so I'm really looking forward to it. This is my first one, so be nice. Be nice.
Well said. Be nice. Thank you. Thank you so much. I love it. Paul, straight with it. Exactly what Paul has done is what I was gonna gesture to, that we should be introducing ourselves in the chat. I've also put that in the chat to say, where are you from? So what's your name? Where are you joining from? What's your feeling word? And what's one thing you are looking forward to now? An example is Kulu, who is joining from South Africa, maybe feeling energetic, but looking forward to reading up more on climate change and women. So in the chat, just as we get started, please make sure that you do that. So that, as we go through the workshop, we know exactly who we are speaking to, and you know exactly who you're speaking to. I'm a little bit of a regular, so maybe there's no need for me to introduce myself. But then maybe let me just do it. So my name is Michelle, and I am on the education team as well at the African Climate Alliance. And I'm going to be co-facilitating, as I said, the workshop. So please, whatever questions you have, pop them in the chat. We'll also give you an email address that you can reach us at, which is a very exciting thing. The education team at the African Climate Alliance, after several years, now has a dedicated education-related email address. I couldn't be more excited, and all those details will come a little bit later. So please stick with us until the end. Cool. So maybe getting into it, a little bit into it, is I am extremely, extremely happy that you joined and you signed up to the workshop today, where we're going to be looking at how history informs our work, right? So we want to understand the gendered impact of climate change on women. Another way we can frame this is understanding how women are impacted by climate change. So that's what we're going to be doing for the rest of the session today. So I'm gonna sort of start us off with sort of painting the scene, right? Understanding how we got to where we are, understanding the kind of different impacts or kind of the different experiences that women bring into the space, especially when we start talking about climate change. And then a little bit later on, I'm going to hand over to Chulu, who's going to walk us through a case study. So really putting it into context. So everything that we would have done the first part, and then going, actually, this is how we see it in real life. Because a lot of the times we run the risk of being extremely theoretical, that we don't really offer practical stuff, like this is what we mean when we say this is how women are impacted by climate change, simply because they are women, right? So that's what we're going to be doing. I love it. I see so many people engaging in the chat. Absolutely love it. Please don't stop. We'll be looking at that throughout the meeting as well. Before we get straight into it, just wanting to note that the concepts and the ideas that we introduce in today's workshop can also be workshopped on their own. And you will see this when we go through. They can be their own workshop. They can even be, like a module. They can be a subject. We can discuss women. We can discuss the impact of climate change on women. We can discuss climate change. We can discuss gender as it relates to climate change. So what we're doing here is sort of introducing this topic and laying the groundwork so that when we are engaging outside of the space, we have a foundation to build on. So just a small just a small disclaimer, and I'm extremely excited to be getting into it. We've spoken a little bit about the check-in. Please make sure to be doing that. I love it. I see so many people checking in the chat, which is awesome. So, as you will know, a lot of the times when we start with these, we have a set of agreed rules of engagements, right? So how are we going to show up into the space, and what does that look like? What does that even mean? The first is to please raise your hand if you have a question or a contribution. Please don't just unmute, which brings me to a related part. If you do have something to say, please raise your hand. Please put stars in the chat, just like this. I'll put stars in the chat, just like this. If you have something to say, if you can't find the button that allows you to raise your hand, I know sometimes I struggle finding it. And if you'd like to agree with something, you can also add plus signs just like that. So please raise your hand if you have a question or a contribution. Please also make sure to not just unmute, especially like now when I'm speaking. Please make sure that all of your microphones are on mute, but also if someone else in the room is also speaking, to also practice the same thing. So this is not just directed to Mitchelle or Chulu, it's to every single person who's in the room. And then to practice the rule of 2. This allows for 2 people to speak or contribute before you contribute again. We are actually going to try this. I saw Panashe is in the house with us. Chulu is in the house with us as well. So what I'll do is I'll speak a little bit, and then I will call on Chulu. Chulu will say what Chulu is going to say, and then they'll pass on to Panashe, who will also say what they need to say, and then they'll pass back to me. So we are quickly going to practice what the rule of 2 looks like, just so everyone in the room knows exactly what that looks like. So, Chulu?
Thank you. I was finding my unmute button. Yeah. So like I said, I'm really excited to be here and really glad to be here. I'm also happy that Panashe is here. I just met Panashe a few days ago, so that was amazing. We have a couple of they-thems in the room. So yeah, Panashe.
Hi, Chulu. Hi, everyone. It's so lovely to be here and to engage in this workshop. I hope you will learn something that's very effective. And yeah.
Oh, thanks, Panashe and Chulu. So what we just saw there was the rule of 2. I waited until 2 people spoke before I could speak again. This doesn't really apply in the chat, but it does apply for when you're on mute. When you're on mute and you want to contribute to the space, please make sure that you have let 2 other people speak before you speak again. Then to feel free to use your home language. We know that English, and we do apologize for this, the fact that English is the primary mode of communication in this space, at least. We apologize for that, and we ask that you feel free to use your home language, because we do hope that at least someone else in the room will be able to translate for us. Otherwise, if that's not possible, we can always go to Google Translate, although we know that that's not always an accurate translation. It can help us break down those barriers in communication. So please feel free to use your home language as well. And then lastly, feel free to use the chat. You're more than welcome. I see so many people using the chat, which again is super awesome. Yeah. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we are going to be looking at the impacts of climate change on women, with a specific focus on a case study that's going to be introduced a little later on, that Chulu is going to walk us through. But before we really get into it, why are we here, right? We want to unpack the impact of climate change that women face simply because they are women, and because they are women, they're exposed to these gender roles, specifically meaning that there are things that are expected of them simply because they are women. And that's what we mean by gender roles, right? We must also build in the space an understanding on how this impact and its history has shaped our work in climate justice. You hear a lot of people say the environmental movement in South Africa or in Africa is built on the backbone of women. What does that mean? You hear something like feminism, for instance. We hear that a lot. We hear ecofeminism, especially in the climate justice space. What do those things mean? So before we really get to defining all those things, we want to lay this foundation where we can start speaking about the impacts of climate change on gender, or how gendered people are impacted differently by climate change. If you do have a question, we will have a Q&A session at the end where we can, well, in the middle really, where we can ask some of the questions. But otherwise, you feel free to use the chat to ask some of the questions. I will see them. Or you can even raise your hand. I will also see raised hands, and then we can give you an opportunity to speak. So feel free to do that. So we must build an understanding on how this impact and its history has shaped our work in climate justice. And we should always remember that climate change, and by extension, climate justice, right? So we wouldn't have this term climate justice if we didn't have climate change. Our core focus is on our work, I assume all of us in the room. And as such, we must speak to all groups of people despite their diversity or despite their identity, right? Like, we should never walk up to someone and go, oh, because you're a high school person, I should not be speaking to you about climate change. That already puts a barrier to our work, or how accessible our work becomes questionable, because then it's not accessible for everyone, right? So then to really just start with what we mean by gendered impact. And by we, I really mean everyone in the room. So please bear with me. So what do we mean when we say gendered impact? And why is it important for us to interrogate gendered impacts on human rights defenders? And by human rights defenders, we really are using these terms more in a broader sense. I believe that just by virtue of being in this room, on this call, we are human rights defenders. When we advocate for the environment, we do so through defending human rights as well. Very, very short example is, if I cannot have access to clean air because of climate change, it means that one of my human rights to clean, breathable air is then infringed, right? So if I can advocate for clean air, I'm also advocating for human rights. And by that right, I become a human rights defender. So why then is it important for us to interrogate gendered impacts on the gendered impact of climate change on human rights, or as human rights defenders? Well, because people of different genders experience things differently due to their identities. I really do like using examples. So you hear me say, for example, right? I come from a house of 4 girls. I don't have any brothers, but if I did have a brother, the way that I would be impacted by, I don't know, if I think about traditional African households, and what we often see is that a lot of the times the girl child does a lot of the housework, has a lot of that responsibility, even if they're both the same age. So if I had a twin brother right now and I lived in any part of Africa, you would find that maybe my education is not made as important as my twin brother's, you know? And we see this a lot. We see this so much that that's just what it is. Some countries do place value on the boy child getting an education rather than the girl child. And that's not right, right? That's not right at all. But that's what we mean when we say the gendered impacts. So when we speak about the gendered impacts of climate change, that's one of the things we're looking at as well. That's what we're talking about. We're saying, how are different groups of people affected differently by climate change? And to better help us ensure justice is achieved for all groups of people, we have to understand that. We must understand that Mitchelle might be impacted differently by climate change because she's based in South Africa, whereas someone else who's maybe coming from Uganda or Malawi or Zambia is also impacted by differently because they're from that place, or because they're Malawian, or because they're Ugandan, or because they're Tanzanian, right? Because those are the identity factors that that affect the way that we not only interact with the world, but that we also interact with disasters. We often hear this idea of first world countries versus third world countries, developed versus underdeveloped, strong healthcare system versus not so strong, developed in terms of infrastructure versus not. So all of those things are also identity factors that contribute to the way that we experience the disasters when they do come. So like floods, fires, droughts, those things. People of different identities are affected differently by all of these disasters. And one thing that we must always understand is that climate change affects people differently on the basis of their gender. Therefore, climate justice responses, like when there is a disaster, how are we responding to it? Or as climate justice advocates, we must always take that into account. How are we doing that? And we'll see later on with the case study, because it's perfect. It's a perfect representation of what we see a lot in this space. And then when we speak about intersectional responses, so when we speak about climate responses, what we mean by responses, we're talking about disaster responses even. So first aiders, people who respond first responders to disaster. We see there are so many organizations that do this work. One of them is, I can only think of Holy Cross at the moment, but we also have like religious institutions who do this. We have NPOs who do this. And if we can think about any others, please feel free to use the chat to also say this other one. So what we are speaking about when we say responses, we are talking about either individuals who respond to a disaster, or we're speaking to and about organizations that do the work, groups of people essentially. So when we speak about intersectional responses, we are now going to get into it. But we first need to understand what intersectional is. Now we understand what a response is, right? For us to understand what an intersectional response is, we must first understand what this word intersectional means. What is this word intersectional? What are we saying when we speak about intersectionality? And intersectionality is a tool that allows us to understand how our linked and stacked identities inform the kind of struggles we face. Some people might even say our compounded identities. And you hear a lot of the times in the climate justice space or in the justice space, you hear that a lot of the times when we do discuss these different identities and how they're formed and how they're stacked, we might actually be looking at how different groups of people in our society are oppressed because of the identities that they hold, or the kinds of barriers that they experience simply because of who they are. And, it's not like that's something that I can choose. I never chose to be a Black woman from Africa living in South Africa, but actually originally from Zimbabwe. No, that's not something that I chose. But because I am that, it means that I am affected differently by different things. So a lot of these things are true. I'm a Black woman. I am from Zimbabwe. I live in South Africa, right? I am currently working. I'm also at school. So all these 5 things I've mentioned are true. We can't take away my Blackness. We can't take away that I'm a Black woman, right? We also can't take away that I am a woman, right? Because that is part of my identity. So when we speak about this idea of linked and stacked, this is what we're talking about. We also can't take away, for instance, if you've engaged with me a little bit more, you will know that I'm very, very passionate about technology. So I can actually be a woman in STEM. Well, actually I am, because that's what I'm studying. I'm studying computer science. And that's also an identity factor, right? I'm a woman who's in a specific field. I'm also a Black woman in the environmental space. So we can now kind of see how my identity looks like this, almost like woven. So you can't take away any parts of my identity, maybe to make life easier for me. That's always going to be what my life is. That's always going to be what my life looks like. So when we speak about our linked and stacked identities in the and how they inform the kind of struggles we face, this is what we're talking about. Also, because of my identity historically, I might not also have access to opportunities. I might not have easy access, rather, to higher education, for instance, right? Because historically speaking, women, Black women in particular, have not always been allowed to go to higher institutions. And this could either be as a product of what society speaks on, how society relates to Black women or women in general, or how society hasn't changed. And that's where this idea of intersectional responses, intersectional justice comes into play, because we must understand that people are not, I'm not just Mitchelle, right? I am Mitchelle with all of these other sub-identities, or all of these core identities, actually, not sub-identities, because all of them make the core of who I am. So it's all of these cores that then form together to become this bigger core. So a social justice practitioner and lawyer at the time, Kimberly Crenshaw, introduced the term intersectionality. And this was as a way to show how gender and race discrimination were related. And one of her focuses was gender, obviously, but also on Black women factory workers at the time. She wanted to understand how they are being discriminated against because they were Black, because they were women, and also because they were working class, they were working factory workers. So with all of this understanding, we must always consider how different identity markers, such as gender, race, class, I've mentioned a lot of these also in my own personal example, and how they affect the way that people are impacted by climate change or other disasters and events. Those who are joining from South Africa might be familiar with what was happening in KZN, or how really just KZN is a vulnerable province. It always is a stretch, but more times than not, the KwaZulu-Natal experiences these natural disasters. Sometimes it's floods. Recently in the Eastern Cape, there was a serious drought, and then, it was just bad. So all of this, and by me being in the Western Cape, I don't always experience the same impacts of climate change. So understanding how different people are affected by the impacts of climate change, either because of where they live or simply because who they are, is very, very important for our fight for climate justice as well. Right, are we still together? Do we have any questions? I don't see hands. I see a thumbs up. Yeah, so I'll go by that. I don't see any questions, I don't see any hands, and I don't see anyone unmuting. So I will just continue. Thank you, Chulu, gift of the givers, Medicine Sans Frontiers. Thank you so much. I was thinking, which other responders are there? And as I mentioned earlier, there are so many organizations that do similar work. Thank you so much, Chulu, for putting that in the chat. I'm only saying it now. Thanks, Calvin. Carry on. We are following. Beautiful. So then after all of this, after everything that we've now spoken about, after understanding intersectionality and how it and remember the disclaimer that we gave at the very beginning. We spoke about how a lot of these concepts can also be workshopped by themselves. So this idea of intersectionality as well, we can actually do a deep dive on intersectionality. So a lot of what I'm giving is also just foundational information. It's stuff that's meant for us to build on top of it, right? But now, how does all of this that we've been discussing, intersectional responses, intersectionality, women in climate change, the gendered impacts of climate change, how does all of this apply to women? And how can we also relate this to climate justice? And how can we also link this with climate justice responses or just disaster responses? This is where it gets interesting, right? Because women have a unique experience, or women have unique experiences simply because they are women. Like, I have a unique experience simply because I'm a woman. That's unique to me. Whatever I experience in life, I experience it through the lens of a Black woman in South Africa. So women have those unique experiences simply because they are, but they also have societal and gendered roles. That means that society has placed expectations on my shoulders as a Black woman in South Africa to either behave a certain way, do things a particular way, maybe speak a certain way, maybe engage with people in a specific way. This is what we speak to when we say societal roles, right? What is society saying me as Michelle should be doing, and how should I be doing it? But they also have what we call gendered roles. It simply means that, so when we look at history, we see it's always been just maybe from a literature perspective, it's always been men and women, or men versus women. And men have been given a specific set of roles. You go hunt, you go do all this crazy, dangerous stuff. And we see people who've now got crazy because of those things. We see, sorry for that. We see all of these different expectations that are placed on people simply because they are who they are. So men, they go run around, they go hunting. And I mean, we do see this still in some parts of the world, but generally speaking, I'm talking now from a historical lens. And women, what were they expected to do? Maybe stay at home, become what they call the home worker. Or the homemaker, the house. I don't know. We have all of these terms where people now become housewives and all kinds of things because of who they are, simply because of their gender as well. So as women, then you are expected to become a mother. You are expected to cook. You're expected to clean. You are expected to, in some cases, work and clean. So all of these are what we also speak to as gendered roles. So I hope I've made a clear distinction between what society says this is what you need to be doing as a person who falls under such a subgroup. And then we've also got gendered roles. And this is how also at times could be how society, and in this case, when I say society, I'm also talking about maybe your immediate environment. Right. So in your community, how or what are these expectations that women generally have been told that this is what they have to be simply because they're women? I hope that I'm making sense. If someone has a question or even a correction, please feel free, because this is a learning space for all of us. Feel free to put your hand up, or you can feel free to also just use it in the chat. So I've given such examples. Women are typically the ones that do household chores and care work, and this can affect the way that they interact with society, right? Either in the workplace or in schools. Maybe you've been told that as a woman, this is how you behave. You're not too loud, you're not too bold, you aren't a risk taker. You know, all these different things that many people are told simply because they are who they are. And maybe even in schools, right? We even see this as people are told to show up in certain ways. And this also informs how, or it results in how women are impacted by climate change, right? So simply because they are women and maybe they are at home a lot of the times, it means that when a disaster strikes, they're going to be relating to that disaster quite literally differently to how other people would have who are not women, right? Wonderful. So I know that was a lot. I know that was so much. I do want to come to this part where we now have a chat, right? If you have questions, maybe you've been holding on to the questions, you've got comments, we can have a brief discussion. So I'm just going to stop sharing. I'm going to stop sharing and give time to everyone on the call to make comments, to have questions, for us to really just discuss this. I often don't like to pick on people, but I might have to. Do we have any volunteers? There's Sarah. Yes, please go ahead, Sarah. If you can unmute.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here and attend this session. And whatever you said is very true, and I really relate to it. Especially if you have a country that still follows some of these, African values whereby women are expected to do certain things and you can't speak out or against it. Like in my country, it might sound ancient, but still people do force girls, young teen girls to get married to old people, and these things still happen. And like relating it to the environment, like such people also do face things differently, as you have said, because most of these ladies don't end up finishing school, so you find they don't get information about the environment, or they don't really get information on how they could work and to stop some of these disasters in case if it comes to their homes and things like that. So it pretty much affects all of us differently. And coming from an African, from an African perspective, and a country that still upholds these old values of getting married and things like that at a very young age, and all of these things like really do apply to us. Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that. And just also echoing that still is something that exists. Like people are still going through this. I think it's always important because often when we speak about it, we're thinking, no, it must be happening, or it must have happened a long time ago. But thank you so much for sharing that it is still happening now and people are still being forced to do things that they really don't want to do. Can I ask where you're from? Where you're
I'm
joining
from
us
South
from?
Sudan. I'm from South Sudan. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that also just helps us understand that that's still a reality for some people. So thank you for sharing. And yeah, and also thank you for joining us today. I also see Tele Sand. Go ahead. And then after Tele, we'll give over to Tahira. So Tele, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's Sally here. I am with the Cape Town Unitarian community, and I work in the social justice field. But as I said in my comment as well, intersectionality is such an important concept that we need to embrace. I think that a lot of times there's still a lot of division that we need to face, in the world. And there always seems to be these narratives on what makes us different, what makes us separate, what makes us, not be able to connect with each other. And so for us to look at how do things overlap is just so important. But just another thought that came up while I was listening now was around when you guys were speaking about, this African traditions and African values and things. And I kind of felt that I didn't really relate to it personally. So I'm not sure if it's the case in other African countries, but sometimes here in South Africa, the term African is used, but it only applies to a certain section of the population, almost as if all South Africans are not African, even though we were born in Africa. So even though in my culture, it isn't as prevalent to have the kinds of gender roles and gender stereotypes that I hear about in other cultures, certainly due to colonialism. It's something that was sort of forced on us. And a lot of times, for me personally, when I delve into the indigenous knowledge systems of my culture, then I find that a lot of things that I thought was tradition is actually colonialism. And so, I really encourage these spaces that we have where we are learning together and where we are discussing things with each other so that we can just broaden our horizons around things, and sometimes also learn that there's a lot more overlap than we sometimes realize. So thanks again so much, ACI.
Thank you so much, Sally, for that. And I apologize for saying your name wrong earlier. But thank you for that contribution. I think it is very important for us to, you know, investigate. As you said, like some of what we say is tradition can also be attributed to colonialism, which I think is very, very interesting as well. I think we must do that. We must always interrogate for the work that we do, for us to have a deeper understanding. And I think even in connection with the work that we do, we must properly understand where some of these things come from. Is it tradition? Is it colonialism? How does it influence or feed into the work that I do? How can we, I mean, one example is how, generally speaking, depending on where you're from, and again, this can be very different in terms of context and different people and their contexts, how women generally have been stewards of the earth. So they've been the environmental defenders, but without the title, which I think is interesting. So I'm just putting that to the space as well for us to kind of think about it. Tahira, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here. Yeah, so I really like, I was really moved by what you said and how climate change and gender are like so intersectional, and I really have a new perspective on it, like how just being a woman and especially part of a specific group, you have access to certain resources or lack of access to resources, and you live in a certain area and you have certain societal expectations, and how climate change impacts you differently because of those factors. And I just wanted to link back to what the previous speaker said about colonialism and how especially in South Africa, the segregation laws in the Group Areas Act kind of forced certain ethnic groups into areas where they won't have a lot of green spaces and proper drainage systems, which can make their impacts of climate change a lot more severe than other areas. And I just wanted to ask a question on how especially can those groups, especially whether you are more severely impacted, how can you be a steward of the planet in terms of becoming more active, or what exactly did you mean by historically being stewards of the planet? I'm just interested in that.
Cool. So Tahira, I'll just put a pin on that a little bit, and then we can just explore it just before we get to the next part of the workshop. So please also just pop that question in the chat so that I can also look at it. So thank you for that question, and thank you so much for those reflections as well. I'm going to pass over to Leta.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much. So my question is around, I guess, biases within the justice space. So how do we deal with the biases that exist when we are looking at intersectionality, especially for minority groups within minority groups? So, for example, if we're looking at the gendered impact on women, and then we zone in on women living with albinism, there was a program that I was part of where we were trying to, assist women living with albinism that are harshly impacted by the heat that has been, as a result of climate change in the area, because they cannot afford things like sunscreen, right? And so petitioning and having movements for them was so difficult, even within the justice space, because people just felt like that was not a group to consider within the bigger, women being affected kind of thing. So being a Black woman, yes, you have access to funding, but being a Black woman living with albinism, then your doors are kind of closed. Or being a Black woman of a certain age living with a certain disability, that makes you more prone to certain impacts, then you aren't advocated for as much. So how do we deal with those kind of biases within this social justice and in this climate justice space that we are working in? Because as an ecofeminist, it's really difficult to advocate for minorities within minority groups that are often overlooked. Thank you.
Thank you, Letaho, for that question as well. Tahira, can I please ask for you to put your question in the chat, just so it's very accurate that when we do address it. I will give a go at answering some of the questions, and then I'll also call on some of my colleagues who are also in the space to add should they feel. So I'll start with how can we address how can we address the biases that exist in our space or in the justice spaces for minority groups and in minority groups? So I think when we start educating ourselves a little bit deeper about the issues that affect those minority groups. So if we're speaking about women, Black women living with albinism. So if we look at it from that perspective, we can first understand how Black women are affected by whatever it is that we would be investigating, right? We could be looking at, let's look at it from an environmental perspective. We could be looking at how Black women are affected by droughts, maybe in the Eastern Cape. And then we look at how Black women living with albinism are affected, because it's true that they're all Black women, but how they are affected is completely different. But we also need to understand how those people are affected. So I'll start with that, like first understanding deeply the context in which we're working, right? That allows us to also address those biases, because I'll give another example is if I'm working on something, right, I'm very aware that I already have internal biases that I hold as a person who exists in society. That's just something that is objectively true. Like, we cannot run away from that. But if I'm working, say, alongside Chulu, who has maybe a completely different experience to mine, it's very highly unlikely that we're going to share the same bias, right? So if by working with Chulu on a project, it highly likely means that they might be in a space where they can say, hey, Michelle, check your bias, right? And sometimes it's not always as evident as that. Sometimes it is, I feel like a lot of the times when we work on these issues together as units, like we heard from Sele earlier, where they were mentioning that there is a lot of division, and that division means that we are subcategorizing people, and when we do that, we feed into these biases. So I think that's almost my contribution to that question specifically. I think if we can work together to find the root of the issues and really address the biases, we are better placed to find proper solutions that are in alignment with whatever issues would have happened. So those are kind of my initial thoughts. Chulu, have you got any thoughts on that question?
I think you sum it up nicely. It's really about, us trying to hold each other accountable and hold space for each other. And because also some of us, we have different experiences, like you said, unique experiences. So it is not like an immediate thought of yours that actually that is not like the right thing to say, or, the right train of thought. And so you're able to like sort of hold yourself accountable, and like people around you, there's always that room for them to hold you accountable. I always say that sometimes you say things, right? And you're like, ooh, that was bad. Now you realize that you are unlearning, or you are also relearning when you say the thing, but you also have that thought of that was not supposed to be said, right? So that means we are growing in that sense. So it's really important that we hold ourselves accountable and we hold those around us accountable, not in a necessarily confrontational way, but just in a sense of holding space for each other. You know, I can imagine, for example, the KZN floods, how much people who are not South Africans struggled with getting medical care. Because so you see those compounding identities then when there's such things as xenophobia, racism, for example, we saw with the war in Ukraine, where there were like Black people at the back of the line, you know, those kind of things. So these might not be immediate thoughts that we have, but an afterthought. And it's important that we entertain that afterthought.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I also do see that Tahira has put the question in the chat, so thank you for doing that. Also, if someone else has thoughts in the group, please feel free to unmute or even send a message onto the group, into the chat. That's also very helpful, because one of the things that I always like to say is that we don't know it all. We're all learning in this space, and that's what I like about this space, is it's a learning space for everyone who's in it. Sarah, I do see you. I don't know if you'd like to contribute, answer the same question, or maybe a different question from Tahira, whichever one you're comfortable with. The thumbs up tells me that everything has been summed up. Yes, great. I'll go by that assumption. So Tahira says, how does climate change affect women and young female students in particular, and how can climate justice empower them? So I'll also try my hand at answering it, purely from my understanding, and then I'll pass on to Chulu or anyone else in the space who would like to also go have a go at it. So remember the small example that I brought at the very beginning, where I said, had I had a twin brother, for instance. And we are going to see this a lot more when we move into our case study, because it does also interrogate how women were affected, particularly women who are affected by climate change. And if I look at that example where it's me, the girl child, and, you know, my counterpart could be my brother, the boy child, and how we would be exposed to different opportunities simply because we are who we are, simply because I'm a girl, and simply because you would have been a boy, right? It means that now in the scenario that I gave, and I know that it's not always like that, but in the scenario I gave, it was me bearing a lot of the household, the chores, the work, the responsibility from a very young age, and that becoming priority more than my education. So it means even if, and we see this a lot, even if I want to pursue higher education, it's always, but who's going to help out around the house if you go away to university? Whereas he's a lot more free he would be a lot more free to pursue that and to do those things simply because he's a boy. This also depends on the society that you're coming from. This also becomes a thing of context. Like we heard a little bit about what's going on from Sarah in South Sudan, is that young people, young women specifically, are pressured to get married. And a lot of the times it's so they can become care workers. So I become married so that I can take care of maybe his family and the kids, and then I maybe put my dreams on hold, or maybe I cannot pursue so many things at the same time, because I like to think of it as the odds might be against you in that way. So just imagine running a household and trying to pursue school, and you are maybe the primary care worker, and then disaster strikes, right? Disaster strikes. It a lot of the times is going to be extremely difficult for me to rebuild my life, simply because I am missing a lot of those stepping blocks, right? I am missing that education that I could have got if I was a boy. I am missing all of those opportunities that maybe I would have been encouraged to go for if I was a boy. And I really am trying so hard not to preempt the next part of the workshop, because Chulu is going to go through it very beautifully. But I think that is a very small kind of way that I understand how sometimes women are affected by climate change. And then how climate justice can help to empower them is by shining a light on the issue. Right? Sometimes we don't get to address things simply because we don't know that they do exist. So if we can shine that light on the issues that exist, and we say this is the problem and these are the possible solutions, just by doing that, or just by showing that women can stand up for themselves, we unknowingly empower them. But then it's now a thing of becoming a lot more intentional with the ways that we empower those same people. So how are we saying, don't look at whatever you would have been confronted with as a, like, that's your destination, that's it. How can we then draw strength from that? Because there is sometimes a lot of value that comes from our experience. So just by us experiencing that, we maybe think of the world differently. We maybe look at things differently. And those are some of the things that we do need to lean into. So I have tried to answer that question a little bit. Chulu, I don't know if you'd like to have a go at it. And then I also see, so you can go ahead, and then I'll read some of the comments from the chat.
Okay. I was gonna say that maybe this question, let's deal with it at the end. So after the case study, then we can come back to it. Great.
See, I was fighting hard not to preempt the case study, because I was like, some of these answers are at the end. But then I would not expect that Tyra would have guessed that. But Sally said, and always something to learn or relearn, because justice is a practice. Absolutely, justice is a practice. And it's also a continuous practice. I don't think we can ever get to a point where we're like, justice has been achieved, now we wait. Because it's also work to make sure that justice is maintained. So thank you for that. Jeffrey said, I think cultural norms are one of the dangerous viruses affecting gender, especially in Africa. Before much awareness, I think research can be very helpful to avoid bandages as wound healing treatments. It's true that women and girls are facing things differently, and we need to act. Thank you so much for that. And with that, I'm going to take a little bit of a backseat in the next sort of part of the workshop and hand over to Chulu. Thank you again, everyone, for really just engaging with us part in the Q&A, and yeah, for your time. So Chulu, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. I'm just gonna try and share my screen quickly. Okay. Ooh. Can we see that?
Yes, we can, but it's not being presented.
Okay.
Yes.
Can everyone see now? Okay, cool. Hello, everyone, again. So we decided that we are going to do the case study of Cyclone Freddy, to sort of demonstrate the issues that Michelle was talking about and how there is a need for sort of responses that speak to people's identity and the struggles that are then informed by those identities. So we're going to have like a quick popcorn style sort of thing. Does anyone know Cyclone Freddy and what happened or what is still happening with it now, how they were affected if they were in the regions that were affected by Cyclone Freddy, and so on? You can popcorn style and unmute yourself, or you can just drop it in the chat box. And you don't need to raise hands. It's fine. We're popcorning.
Good evening. Good evening. So, from what I heard was that Cyclone Freddy was a terrible cold, and a lot of people were I think were dying from the cold. I don't know if there were just rumors or there was some truth to it, but what I know is that it's coldness and the terrible one.
Okay, thank you, Natasha. Anyone else want to take a stab at it?
Hello, everyone. Once again, my name is Geoffrey Manasseh from Malawi. We witnessed Cyclone Fred here. I know the story of Cyclone Fred. were so much brutal, killing people, and displaced a lot of families in Malawi, especially the southern part of Malawi. And they even left people without, food, without clothes, without, whatever it sounds like, the assets and everything to them. So, yeah, that's a brief information I know about the cyclone. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoffrey. So Puti is saying yes, and tropical cyclone Freddy was a prolonged cyclone which went on for a very long time. Lidaho also basically just reiterating that it happened around Feb, March, and was the longest lasting tropical cyclone recorded in the world. So you can imagine the kind of impact that had. Sorry. Okay, cool. So some background on Cyclone Freddy. So it is said to have hit Malawi, spreading over to Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Madagascar, Eswatini, and South Africa. So those were the 5 countries that were affected. And this started around the beginning of Feb until mid-March. So that means the cyclone, in recorded terms, on the internet, lasted for over a month, and only just ended around mid-March. And it claimed hundreds and thousands of people's lives. Like Geoffrey was saying, that a lot of people were displaced, a lot of people were hurt. So there was like a need for urgent medical responses. There was a need for shelter, for people to stay in. There was a need for food, for clean water. So you can imagine the kind of chaos the cyclone caused, especially spanning over a month. Having people displaced and not knowing where their next meal is going to come from, not knowing where they're going to be sleeping that night and for the rest of the month, really. So it damaged things like infrastructure, like clinics, schools, all sorts of things, roads, homes. They were really affected. Even some religious buildings were not able to withstand how strong the cyclone was. And the fact that it was so prolonged only increased that even more, that sense of insecurity for people. So with these regions or these countries that were affected, Malawi was the one that was hit the most in terms of what is recorded. Of course, experiences differ. There could be someone from South Africa that says, actually, the sort of adversity that I experienced because of the cyclone was much worse. So worse really is relative when it comes to speaking about people's experiences and so on and so forth. And so we are then going to use this case study to then see how the part of the workshop that Mitchelle has just gone through on intersectionality can be applied on Cyclone Freddy, and how experts and researchers and human rights defenders on the ground in Malawi, in Madagascar, in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, in Eswatini, and in South Africa, how they say these experiences should be dealt with in a way that is not a blanket approach, but really centers people and tries to offer equitable help. So help that is not just saying, okay, we're going to give everyone the same thing, but really caters to the experiences, the specific experiences that people were having, and also the experiences that are a result of the aftermath of the cyclone. If I'm moving a bit too fast, please tell me to chill and calm me down a bit, because I do talk a bit fast. Okay, so using the lens that Mitchelle has already introduced us of having gendered experiences and gendered impact because of societal roles, gendered roles, and so on, we are then going to look at the impact in particular when it comes to women and how Cyclone Freddy affected women. So as everyone knows at this point, that Cyclone Freddy displaced a lot of people, especially in Malawi. I think the focus, for purposes of like moving along faster, I will keep on saying Malawi because it is said to be the region that was hit the most and most adversely by the cyclone. But when I talk please assume that I am including the other countries, Zimbabwe, Zambia, South Africa, Eswatini, Madagascar, and Mozambique. So when you hear me keeping on and saying, Malawi, 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 I'm referring to all of the countries, but obviously using Malawi because it was the one country that really was paid attention to because of the adverse impact that they felt because of the cyclone. So during the cyclone, a lot of people were displaced, but in particular, women were displaced much quicker. You know, there is this belief in the research and gender studies sort of fraternity that women, as proved by research, are most likely to fall under the poverty line. So they're already living a life of insecurity, in a sense, especially women in rural areas and so on. So then that means the sort of material that they build in, or like the places that they get to build in, are not the most suitable places to place a building, and don't have the capacity and ability to withstand harsh weather conditions like strong winds and extreme rainfall and floods. Right. And so this was reflected in Cyclone Freddy because women were affected more adversely because their homes were then easier to lose due to harsh weather conditions with the strong winds and the strong rains. Right. And this was particularly because their homes were not built with material that could withstand extreme weather conditions. And so because of that, they were easily displaced, as opposed to someone who then had like at least this proper infrastructure when it comes to their house, that is built with proper material, that is durable, and that is long lasting. And so at least is able to withstand to a certain degree. So women were easily displaced by the cyclone because of that. And added to that, when they now go out and seek refugee, we spoke about different sort of organizations that offer help, you know, when things like natural disasters and, you know, these sort of things happen. We do have organizations that try out and help. We mentioned the Holy Cross Foundation. We mentioned the Medicine Sans Frontiers. We mentioned, what was the other one? Gift of the Givers. So those are the kinds of sort of organizations that would then be the first responders, sometimes even before government response, sometimes even before the UN via UNICEF and all other organizations respond. We find that these small NGOs that work in human defense work, and in particular with food security and medical health care, they would be the ones that respond first, right? And so you'd have your MSF, your Gift of the Givers, and so on responding. But then the problem that women in Malawi, like some women face in cases of adversity, women in Malawi were sexually exploited in the form of aid workers asking for sexual favors in return for them being, what do you call it, admitted into the safety camps and refugee camps. And this is in particular with women because we know that gender-based violence and sexual abuse is something that is running pretty rampant in the African continent and also runs pretty rampant in other parts of the world, you know. So this was a true reflection of how society is in terms of putting sexual value to women, but not putting a much human value. And so that was exploited, that, well, in return of you getting help, in return of you getting medicine, in return of you getting shelter, you then have to trade in transactional sex. And as we know, that is not consensual sex. We can't consider that to be consent because consent has to be given freely and enthusiastically, and there mustn't be any sort of blurred lines in all of that. And this was the problem that we're seeing with medical healthcare workers. And this is not a trend that is only seen with Cyclone Freddy and other like forms of natural disasters and climate disasters. and climate emergencies that we sort of face. I think a couple of years ago, there was a story that broke out that one of the big NGOs that provide healthcare for refugees and so on had actually been exploiting children and women sexually. So this is a trend that we see when these kinds of emergencies happen, that women do get exploited sexually and children also do get exploited sexually. And Cyclone Freddy was not exempt from that. This was also another thing that was happening with Cyclone Freddy. Is everyone still following? Just a little thumbs up before we move to the next slide. Okay, I'm guessing everyone is still with me. Cool. Okay, so another thing that we have to consider is the fact that we do know some parts of Africa are very rural. And so people depend on sort of farming, small-scale farming on the little bit of land that we have. And we know because of colonialism and dispossession and displacement, it's not always arable land, but people try and work with whatever little that they have. And this was the same case with Malawi. You found that there were small-scale farmers that were really affected adversely by Cyclone Freddy, because when the cyclone came with strong winds and strong rainfall, it sort of washed away their crops and had no, like, that was literally their hope of having food. So that being washed away really put a dent in terms of food security for women. And I'm saying this in particular affected women adversely because 65% of the small-scale farming in Malawi is done by women. And the more bigger scale sort of commercial farming, of course, then that is like a whole other topic for another day on white monopoly capital and sort of the gendered sort of discrimination when it comes to being able to own land as a Black woman in Africa, in a rural area, in a rural setting. As you know that in some countries, you still need a man from your family to sign for those kinds of things and all of that as your proxy. So with Malawi, a lot of the rural women were doing small-scale farming. That's like at around 65% of the women. And so it was mostly them who were affected by the cyclone, washing away their crops and leaving them with no hopes for food security. And also at the same time, during climate-related emergencies because of natural disasters and so on, women are the ones that are burdened with the higher levels of unpaid care work and household responsibilities, right? We know that already women typically, in the context of Africa as a whole, it is typically women, whether they are working or not working in terms of like an official job where you have to go out and go work as maybe me as Chulu, come out of home and go work as an education coordinator at ACA, right? Outside of that, there's still these gendered roles that they have to perform at home. And these include doing household chores, so things like washing dishes and cooking and all of that, right? But this also includes taking care of the children. It is most likely the mother that is going to be there when children are sick, for example. It is most likely the mother that is going to be taking the child to the clinic or to the hospital. It's hardly like typically ever the father in that case. So during climate-related emergencies, where you can imagine facilities such as clinics and hospitals, police stations, and all these kinds of things where you can get help have been compromised by the cyclone, it is then women that burden that shoulder of doing the care work, topped off by the household responsibilities of having to do chores, and also just really being concerned of what is your family going to eat and so on. Because at most times, it is also still typically women who have to sort of fend for the family in terms of what is going to be for dinner. It's hardly ever that you're going to ask your father what's for dinner. But when you come back home, you ask your mother what's for dinner, right? So those kinds of things are burdens that are shouldered by women, and they are multiplied even more because you can imagine the kind of diseases that come because along because things such as water and sanitation infrastructures are severely compromised. So things like fresh water sanitation, and so on and so forth are compromised. So that means diseases like cholera, typhoid fever, and so on are very prevalent. And this means that then the mother or even the sisters, because often the roles that are played by the mother are also transferred to the female siblings in the family. So you'd find that this burden is shouldered, that you are maybe a 16-year-old, 14-year-old little girl in a certain part of Malawi, and your mother has to take care of your family, and at the same time you have to then help your mother, you know. So these were the kinds of sort of adversities that women were faced with, in particular when it comes to Cyclone Freddy. And still then, after the cyclone has ended and now there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of things to be done, it is still women who also have to shoulder that burden, because then the rebuilding and replanting of your crops and making sure they grow, having to fend for your family, struggling to find water to cook, to drink, to wash, you know, those kinds of things. I remember, like, when I was a child, I grew up in the Eastern Cape, and it was not even in the sense that we experienced a severe climate-related emergency, but it was just a thing that we knew that my youngest sibling, who's like a toddler, would wash in the bath water, and as the older sibling, you then going to wash after them. So grey water has always been a thing for African people, you know, and that was one way. I didn't understand it then. I didn't even mind it because I didn't even know as long as I was clean. I didn't even like washing. So as long as I was clean, I was fine. 10-year-old me was fine with that, you know. But when you look at it now from this sort of perspective and from this sort of lens, you realize that grey water has always been a thing for Black people, particularly for Black mothers, when it comes to fending for their families, and so on, and making sure that generally everyone is taken care of. And I think the other potent then question that would have to be asked is, who is then taking care of the person that is doing the unpaid care work that women are doing? Who is taking care of the mother that's doing this sort of work? Are we still good? Okay, cool. Why is my slide refusing to move? Okay, cool. So now bringing it back to intersectionality, and now keeping in mind this sort of case study that we just did on Cyclone Freddy, we then understand that there is a need for responses that center intersectionality. So when we're responding, we don't only look at it at the sense of people have been displaced. They need shelter, they need food, they need water, they need healthcare, emergency healthcare, and so on. Yes, that is important. And people, let's mute the person. Okay, great. Yes, it is important that we have those kinds of responses, right, that respond to what people need. But it is also important then to look at how are then men affected by the cyclone? What is needed in particular by a person who is a man, who is a father to the family? What is needed by a person who is a woman, who shoulders so much of this work, who has probably lost most of everything that they own? And this is a person that was already in a vulnerable position even before the cyclone. So that is when then we have to start having intersectional responses where we look at these compounded ideas that as a Black person, how are you affected by this? As a working class person who also is at a high risk of poverty, how are you then affected? As a person who is a woman, who is a mother, and who has children, how are you then affected? And that is essentially what intersectional responses are about. It's looking at the layers that people have of their identity, and then saying, how can I then respond adequately in a way that the struggles that this person is facing because of this compounded and packed identities that they have, I am at least able to offer as much reliefs. So, for example, having something like a sort of creche, for example, at a refugee camp would go a long way in helping a mother, right? because then the mother is able to take care of other things and putting things together for their family, right? And those like just some of the examples, right? And when we look also back to the issue of sexual assault, which is a very big issue, because you're already traumatized by all of this stuff that is happening because of this cyclone, or maybe if it's a drought, you already are facing famine with your family, you've lost everything. And then on top of it all, your body then also becomes another crime scene. Your body is violated at a place that should have been a place of safety. So how would we then make these sort of spaces comfortable for women, and also safe spaces for women to be able to say, I can trust them? Because then that means if these refugee spaces are not places of refuge anymore, that means there will be a lot more women that would much rather opt out to not go to such spaces where they should have gotten the necessary relief that they need and the necessary help that they need, simply because we're not able to respond as different organizations with a very intersectional lens that layers people's identities and recognizes that people are not living unilateral lives. They live multilateral lives where their struggles come from the different parts of them being like this person. It's like an onion. When you peel it, there's another layer. When you peel it, there's another layer. So we should sort of treat people with that same immunity, that I peel off this layer of you being Black. I now peel off the layer of you being women. I now peel off the layer of you being a mother. I now peel off the layer of being this and that and that and that. And that is important in how we then respond. Right. So we also have to ask ourselves important questions like, how can we then lessen the burden of unpaid care work that mothers do, right? And that typically women and young girls do. How can we lessen that in cases of climate-related emergencies? How can we mitigate sexual harassment and sexual assault from aid workers, right? So we have to have these sort of questions that we're constantly asking ourselves, because we understand that this is an ongoing thing where we are constantly going out there as human rights defenders and helping people. So it's important that people get healing from, or maybe a semblance of starting to heal from the refuge and the help that you're offering, not getting re-traumatized and getting new traumas from that. So that is really important when it comes to having an intersectional lens and looking at things as trying to understand how can we respond without using a blanket approach, because these struggles are not experienced in the same way by people who have different identities. And then lastly, to conclude, it's important that we take sort of lessons from history, because these cases that we experienced with Cyclone Freddy were not for the first time that we're experiencing them. And these sort of struggles, it is also not going to be the last time that we're experiencing them. So it's important then that we start thinking of how can we mitigate this and how can we lessen and make sure that spaces of refuge actually become spaces of refuge and not spaces of being re-traumatized again. So it's important that we take lessons then from history and the current affairs that we are experiencing right now, and we sort of learn from that, because it's important. It's okay knowing history, but like if you are not learning from it and you're not applying any of the lessons that you learned from that, then it's like you didn't do anything, you know? So that is like very important. Lessons that we learn from the past and history must always be helping make our future better, because also as human rights defenders, we have to do better. It's like that thing I was saying to the group earlier in the chat, that actually sometimes, because we are unlearning and relearning every day, you will say something, but the fact that you thought, that was wrong, let me rephrase that, let me say this in a better way that is more palatable, or actually that was wrong, period, I shouldn't have said that. The fact that you have those kinds of thoughts means that there's hope yet. The fact that you're able to have that kind of thought means that you're not a bad person. You're actually just unlearning and relearning, because we are conditioned and taught these kind of things, right? You think climate disaster, what does that have to do with gender? So it's important then that we take lesson from these instances and moments in history, and we apply that so that we can get to a point. I think last in June, the conversation was around how we can capacitate each other and build capacity. And so these moments from history and these lessons from history, that is us then building that capacity and understanding that we don't live lives that have single issues. We don't live single issue lives. We live multi-issue lives. And it's important that we tend to all those kinds of issues, because sexual assault is not going to stop because now there's a cyclone. Hunger is not going to stop because now there's a cyclone. So it's important to understand that our identities compound. And as it is summed up nicely in the conclusion, that when our identities compound, it's important then that the responses also should compound. And yeah, I think we can have a bit of a, what do you call it? Question and answer session, bit of discussion, any comments, any clarity. Like we said in the disclaimer before we started, that these ideas themselves, I mean, we could workshop Cyclone Freddy in depth and be talking about the sort of lessons that we can learn from Cyclone Freddy. But for the purposes of this, we had to just give you a taster, and we're hopeful that you're going to go out there and ask yourself, ask people around you, ask Google, always ask Google that, who is Kimberly Crenshaw? What is intersectionality? How does this thing come about? How does it apply to me then as a person that is in Africa? How does it apply to me as a 15-year-old? Where do I feature in all of this, right? So all of these can be workshopped, and hopefully this gives you a sort of nice base and nice start for you to like sort of start off of. Yeah, thank you everyone. Can we get some comments, clarities, questions? Yeah, I will stop sharing my screen. You can give me hands. You can also type in the, I'm trying to see my whole gallery. Oh, great, there we go. You can give me hands, or you can also type in the chat box if you're not quite comfortable as yet. I see that Michelle has posted about the data and reimbursement, so I think we'll talk about that when we close. Zetembe is saying, hi everyone, I'm at a library so I can't unmute myself. I am from KZN Durban, and I've seen how the floods have affected women. These floods left women more vulnerable because they are less able to confront climate change. Women are able to confront these floods due to gender inequalities in society. Women in KZN lack social protection from the government. After the floods, many of them were left displaced. The government promised to build them houses, but most of the houses went to men. In order to get their houses built, many women had to do sexual favors for male government workers. And this is something that we see happening and repeating itself over time. Like I said, climate-related emergencies happening does not stop sexual assault from happening, does not stop exploitation from happening, does not stop people from being sick. So there's all of these issues, and they compounded and added on top of the fact that you are now displaced. And simply because you are not a man, or there's no man in your family that can stand up for you, you are not given a house, so you're not given a place of refuge. Rosa can go first, and then Abigail after.
So hello everyone. This is so important workshop that I joined today. I saw on Facebook because I was looking for something like this. I am my degree is international relations, so it's so important to me as well. In my country, we don't have things like flood or like cyclone stuff. I'm from Angola, but I followed the news and I saw things about flood in Durban as well. And I think that sexual exploitation, many people, when things disaster like that, when disaster like that happens, many people took advantage or take advantage about sexual exploitation. And this type of climate change always affect people in different ways. For example, students can be affected in different ways, and people from the village, they are more marginalized, I think. So I always say, I think that sexual exploitation, they always take advantage when disaster or flood happens. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Rosa. Thank you so much. I mean, that rings true, right? So not only are people from rural areas looked down upon at most times, but they also remain some of the most vulnerable people. I know also in South Africa, this is something that we're faced with, where the sort of services that people need when these kinds of things are happening in these emergencies, they're not as, escalated and get to people as fast as they're supposed to. And unfortunately, sexual exploitation for women and young girls is always a part of it. I really do think that we need to sort of come together and, as human rights defenders, and confront this situation. And I really don't even know where we would begin in terms of sexual exploitation, because you would expect that as a person who works for an NGO that is doing emergency healthcare and all of that, you would have a love for people and you wouldn't want to traumatize them when they're already going through such a traumatic situation. Abigail had her hand up, so you can speak, Abigail, and then I'll read some of the responses from the chat, and then after that, more hands. Abby, if I may call you Abby. Is Abigail still in the chat? Okay, I think we lost Abigail. So Sele is saying, South Africans, please remember that elections are coming up. We need to find out who our ward councillors are, get in contact with them. We have such an amazing constitution, but it is up to us as the people to do our part and take action. This is very important, Sele, because we need to try as young people to push our agenda. There is a real apathy around young people when it comes to political action. I'm really glad also that such a workshop has this amount of young people in it, because we are really having a sort of defeatist attitude because we're tired. We are just generally tired. And I'm hoping that we can also talk more about our mental health and how it's affected by all of this. Yeah, but like definitely keep pressing with our leaders and so on, particularly with councillors in our communities. That is where some of the work can really start, and really try to live green lives. And of course, also around other issues from your community. And it's sort of a down to top approach type of thing happening, coming from the community members to the councillors, all the way up, as people ensuring that our agenda is put forward as young people. Tahira?
Hi. I just also have a question. But first I just want to share something that I also stay and reside in Durban, and through the KZN floods, I saw like a lot of like community-led organizations and like especially schools and churches like leading the like providing a lot more aid than municipalities were like and I saw like that made a profound impact. And also within KZN as a whole, and especially in Durban, like the waste disposal and waste management and is like very like messed up. Like there's a big problem with that. So what happened is during the floods, like a lot of drainage systems, especially in rural communities, were and especially in like township areas, they were blocked, and that caused the flood impacts to be a lot more severe in those areas. And I just wanted to know, like, in terms of creating like maybe a youth-led community organization where we can help to aid in the waste management and pollution management within our communities, because I think like we can do a lot for where like we live, because we know like the where the problems are. So like, how can we get active in our communities in terms of like making an organization and creating a network?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tahira. Some really good provocations there. In terms of what can we do as the people that are here. It's always nice to lead by example and sort of being the change that you want to see and doing something. It's always important. We can have these sort of workshops and they're important for capacitating each other. So that is also like a really good where to from here sort of provocation. Shanae is asking, how can we reach out to be part of this alliance? Let's say we wish to be part of the team for future movements and workshops. Will be there possibility of projects or movements in the future? And how can one become part of it? So always when we have these sort of workshops and dialogues and so on, we do post about them on our social media. But I think also from these attendance registers, some sort of, what do you call it, database is there? I just arrived, so I'm hoping that there is. But if there isn't one, we can also start working on that. But also you can definitely email us. Yeah, Michelle also like wrote the email there. Thank you, Michelle, for that. That is amazing. Yeah, so the email is education@africanclimatealliance.org. And that is where you'll find us. But we try to keep it updated on our social media platforms on Instagram and on Facebook in terms of like what we are doing. So you can reach us there. Abby is back. Okay, Abigail, you can say something and then after that we'll have Sarah. But I'm also very weary of time. So I'll give you two a chance to speak and then check if there's anything more before we check out and close it. Okay, Abigail. Abigail, you can unmute yourself. Okay, Sarah, you can go for now as Abby tries to find us. If Abigail, you're having problems with your mic and with your sound, you can just type it in the chat box. Okay, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you very much, first of all, for the presentation. It was really informative and very helpful to me. And I just realized something like I have been a refugee in Uganda and most of my family members are still there, though I'm in a different place right now. And the type of life they live there, the buildings are all like semi, permanent. It's not like things they get food and everything for survival from the United Nations and things like that. And I was relating it to maybe if a climate disaster happens, how much more would it affect these people who are already vulnerable from war than people who are in like having a much more normal life than them. So it also like the conditions in such places becomes worse because like you're already vulnerable and you've been through a traumatizing experience, which is war, and then a natural disaster brought by climate happens and you get more affected by this. So I just wanted to point out that part as well and something that we could also think about.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. That is, I'm liking the fact that we're getting all of these provocations in terms of what can we do? Where do we move from here? I think we should consider, and I am now speaking to Michelle, Michelle Panache, Sarah F. I'm thinking we might need to have a follow-up. We might need to have a follow-up where we have sort of a strat plan, where we can really discuss where do we move from here and how can we make sure that we tender these sort of very intersectional responses. Abigail, you want to give it a try again? Okay. I will take Rosa and then we will close it with the contributions. Rosa? Rosa?
Yes. I have a question, but before to answer it, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So, okay. As we know, women often face higher risks and greater burdens from the impact of climate change and situation of poverty and due to existing roles, responsibilities, and cultural norms. So my question is, why should rural women lead climate change adaptation?
Oh, someone unmuted. I'm so sorry about that. Rosa, I think you're asking a very important question, and we should really be centering our responses to also being informed by people who are like some of the most affected. It's important that in these sort of platforms we have that, because in as much as we can do as much research as we can in terms of what is happening, but nothing will ever beat experience coming out of the person who experienced it. So it's really important that we open up these spaces where people are able to share their experiences, and we together then sort of plan responses and also ways to just try and prevent, because prevention is always better than cure. So it's important that we also think of prevention strategies.
And with that, I really would like to say thank you again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.